before, being anti-regime and anti-government and so on and so forth. But the problem when it comes to the Arab Spring, I would like to say that we have expected from the elite m- more than they could have provided. As a matter of fact, we live in undemocratic countries. So I think this failure relates to education, relates to pedagogy. And when it comes to the Libyan case, the Libyans describe themselves splendidly, not splendidly, but accurately. They say we are indeed very stubborn when it comes to fighting ourselves. Ghassan Salama is a dear guest, a dear friend, and I expected for him to succeed, but he didn't succeed because the Libyans are very stubborn indeed. That's the problem. Dr. Omar Maghzouz from Algeria. I have just to pose a question to Mr. Ahmed Idris. He has talked about the Tunisian experience and he said that the democracy in Tunisia has not been matured yet. We do know that the Arab Spring emanated from Tunisia and it represented a glimmer of hope for the Maghreb countries for the sake of change. My question is, do you think that you have a stalemate in Tunisia? Uh, have you reached a dead end? This is my question because we need to follow the suit of Tunisia. If it reached a dead end, then perhaps changes won't surface in the Maghreb countries. Mohammed Saad from Mauritania. I have just a public observation. Have we reached a point whereby we need to review the Arab Spring, or do you think that Arab Spring has been continuing with different scenarios, and indeed the Sudanese case can be quoted here? Mohammed Jamil Mansour has talked about Mauritania in accordance with the same uh, scenarios of Algeria and Morocco. I think the background of Mohammed Jamil Siyasi, the political one, supplanted the academic background. The reality is different, and if he wanted for me to hobnob with him, I can do so later, but the time is tight. I would like to congratulate the Mauritanians because the general will be leaving without problems. No, you can't say general is saying, you need to say Mr. President. Yes, Mr. President. I have two observations regarding what Ahmed Idris and Mohammed Maliki had said. The relationship between the 20th of February movement in Morocco and the constitution. Do you think, Dr. Al Maliki, that uh, uh, the constitution was not activated because the 20th of February movement did not have a say in the balances of power on the ground? And that's why the constitution that was officially announced was nothing to do with the constitution that was published in the official gazette. So, following May 2011, we have noticed that the regime uh, uh, had the upper hand, and the regime was comfortable in putting into place the referendum on the constitution, starting from 2013. The other observation is the relation between constitution and law. This would be addressed to Mr. Ahmed Idris. In our countries, we do change the constitutions. In Morocco, we've changed the constitution 5 times, but our laws might go back to 1913. The laws do not change, and there are certain directives that some of the institutions follow rather than the laws themselves. Good morning, Abdel Noor from uh, Paris, eighth university, I would like to talk about the methodology first, and then an addition. It is embarrassing somewhat for the panelists to talk about their own countries as if we have nationalist parallel paths that do not overlap, and this indeed uh, was manifest when you talked about your own countries. We need to talk about the Maghreb region, and it would have been better, perhaps at least, to have to talk about a different country. Otherwise, we'll be kind of talking about Algeria uh, from the perspective of the Algerians, talk about Morocco from the perspective of the Moroccans, and so on and so forth. And I think we need to have overlap between between all the insights. This is when it comes to the methodology. I would like second to thank the panelists for the analysis. There are 2 points here: the reforms and the Arab Spring. The reforms took place before the Arab Spring and continued after, but they surfaced because of the pressure of the street. I think that the reforms before and after were aborted uh, advertently. I think what took place in Morocco and Algeria is a strategic kind of bowing, if I might say, before recovering some of the health that was lacking uh, in those countries. I might bow to weather the storm, and then would be erect and I'll walk along with no changes whatsoever. So, when it comes to the theories of international affairs, they say that democratic operations or processes might not lead to democracy 100%. They might lead to a different kind of outcome, i.e., the transitional renegade or apostasy, if I might say, religiously speaking, and we can think of Egypt in this regard. So these processes cannot lead all the time to democracy. It might lead to apostasy. Uh, those who have HIV, they would have antibodies to coexist with the virus. They might not end up being killed by the virus. So, what I would like to say is that the changes have been cosmetic. The other issue is to do with the reforms. The reforms are ancient indeed, are old, and they go back to 2 centuries ago. We can go back to the central government of Istanbul, Muhammad Ali, and then Tunisia. The same problems are still surfacing. Those who study the literature of 1840s and 1860s, it's as if we are talking about the issues that are taking place in the 21st century. Sorry for taking much of your time. Thank you. Yes, please. I would like to thank you and thank the organizers. My name is Walid Al Abbasi. I'm from the populist Trend Party. I belong to the Popular Front. I'm a member of the Political Bureau. I would like just to comment on the gentleman. What we have noticed that most of the interventions were similar in their readings. We had not witnessed objectivity when it comes to reading the internal affairs of Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and Mauritania. Uh, my first observation is to do with the Tunisian affair, and here I would like to address my intervention to Mr. Idris. You've talked about the state of polarization. You haven't delved into this state of polarization and who was responsible for it. And he turned a blind eye to a very important factor that affected the internal affairs in Tunisia. He turned a blind eye to assassinations that took place in Tunisia, as well as the national dialogue that led to the 2014 constitution. He turned a blind eye to the socioeconomic problems, as well as uh, being taken hostages to uh, uh, the Europeans or the West, and then he committed a blunder. He did not attributed the responsibility to any party. So we cannot just talk by and large in generic fashion. We can't say that all are responsible for eroding, for the trust erosion. uh, we need to call the spade spade. The other part is to do with Libya. Yes, the gentleman was biased. He was biased to what or the so-called the revolution in Libya. There's also a bias in, as far as who are the stakeholders. He also estranged or excluded the tribes that supported the previous regime. My dear brothers, if we wanted a settlement, a genuine settlement in Libya, we need to have a dialogue between the societal components, all of them. And lastly, the gentleman turned a blind eye, dismissed. We didn't focus rather on the foreign interventions, especially when it comes to uh, France and Italy being at loggerheads because they are fighting to get to the wealth of Libya, and this is very embarrassing to us. Thank you. I just have an observation. Some people indeed notice that there is a fluid kind of orderly transition in Tunisia and an exclusion kind of or a peculiar case in Algeria and the fear of the streets in Mauritania, as well as a preemptive kind of actions that that were taken in Morocco. Here I'm talking about uh, the so-called Arab Spring, but the gentleman did not talk about the current situation. They've talked about the past, but what about the now? The gentleman from Libya, I think that he focused on the internal infightings rather than the foreign meddling into the affairs of Libya. Thank you. The time is up. I will take just two more interventions, Louisa, and then we'll come back to you. Thank you. I have two brief questions. The first one is addressed to Muhammad Al Malki. When you've talked about reformulating a new concept of power, do you think that this reformulation can lead to having a constitutional par- parliamentary system in Morocco? The other question is to the Mauritanian gentlemen. You've talked about the reforms and the outcomes of the reform. Would it be possible to talk about the deep state in Mauritania and the affect the influence of of the deep state? Thank you, Nuruddin Arabi from Al Nahda movement in Tunisia. I would like to welcome you in Tunisia. Uh, you've talked about the political transformations in the Arab Maghreb, the outcomes and the prospects. I do agree with Mr. Mansour had said, but I would like to allude to the fact that the Tunisian experience, and here I'm talking in generic terms. I don't want to delve into the details, into the macro politics. I would like to talk about the macro politics here. Uh, the generic kind of propensity of the history of Tunisia was to do with the success of the orderly transition from radicalism to reform or from the undemocratic society into democracy. And this is the diagnosis of the Tunisian experience. When we look at Libya and other experiences outside the Maghreb countries, I think that the problem is to do with the political estrangement or the political isolation, but this did not affect the Tunisian case, but focusing on the political isolation, indeed, in other countries, led to the failure of their entire experience. When it comes to the development and economic outcomes, some of them were negative, some of them were positive. However, we do not agree on the causes. And as you know, we have witnessed crises, we have witnessed uprisings and revolutions in the 80s and the 70s, and the causes or the reasons were socio-political. So here I'm talking about the generic linear path of history. We cannot talk about failure being linked to the Arab Spring. No, we had witnessed revolutions in the past, and they had socio-economic causes, and thus I would like just I would like you to talk about the difficulties rather than the failures. And my third observation is as follows: we can just allude to the foreign intervention in our revolutions. There is indeed a, a powerful influence that can be summarized in the following without calling names. There are certain uh, political personalities that influence or what took place in our country negatively. They said to us, we don't want a positive model, a successful model in Tunisia, and that's why they wanted to throw spanners in the work. Uh, so it is okay to speak about the internal issues, but we need to talk about the foreign intervention. There are plenty. Thank you. I would like to thank you all for your interventions. At the outset, I would like perhaps to build upon what Mr. Ahmed Idris had talked about, i.e., the fragile state in Tunisia. And when we talk to the laypersons in Tunisia, they are disgruntled and they feel the gap that separates them from the state and from the political parties because the Tunisians indeed blame the political scene by and large. And that's why I would like to talk about 2011 and the impetus or the motives of the 14th of January revolution because for the sake of freedom, for the sake of work against corruption, against nepotism, against cronyism. And as a matter of fact, in 2019, we can see that some of such indications uh, or indexes rather were more ominous. Unemployment is more ominous. Indexes of corruption and so on and so forth are more ominous, and they are affecting the Tunisians by and large. There's also the index of participation that has been increasing. Political participation has been decreasing. We are about to have elections 2019. My question to Mr. Ahmed Idris, to what extent these political transformations, to what extent we can consider them leading to democracy in Tunisia, and what is the role of the civil society in Tunisia? And another question to all the panelists: do we need another round of revolutions that are based on projects. Thank you. Thank you, Abdullah Al Qani from Morocco. I think that we are talking about the reform without talking about the prerequisites of the reform. So here we are talking about a set of reforms from the sloganistic kind of point of view that might lead to setbacks. However, when we talk about the experiences of the other nations, indeed they had in place terms of references. In Europe, there were previous revolutions, cultural revolutions, industrial revolutions, religious reforms related revolutions, so a generic societal revolutions uh, that touched upon education, services, and so on and so forth. However, we are talking about reforms without talking about these dimensions. So these kind of sloganistic reforms would lead to setbacks, and this is normal. السلام عليكم ربيع عارفة work at the Ministry of Education in Tunisia. My intervention or my address is addressed, my question is addressed to Mr. Ahmed Idris. You have touched upon a number of points that are important for our dear Tunis. I would like to touch upon 4 points, and I want you to comment on them. The fifth point that would relate to the external factor. I would like to ask you about the intergenerational power at the political elite. Second, what's the role of the party related tourism in the mobility and the disintegration of the scene itself? Thirdly, any comments on the gap between the ruled and the ruler in accordance with uh, what we call the Tunisian revolution that was built on dignity and employment. The fourth one is the covert and overt struggle between the two presidencies and their henchmen. The fifth point is an external point. Would it be possible in Tunisia to wonder uh, about the sensitivity of this period? Uh, do we lack the knowledge of what took place in the rest of the world, especially when we are about to witness elections? Unfortunately, we cannot receive more questions. You will be participating in further sessions. I would like to give the gentleman only 1 minute for the gentleman to answer. I spoke about headlines in my paper, so how could we answer such questions in 1 minute? But quickly, the title would lead us to wonder about the dialectic between uh, change and reform. In 2011, we had witnessed that what the populace demanded not only reforms but radical changes, and this what took place because of the revolutions. The revolutions did not demand reform per se, but they demanded radical reform, and this is difficult nowadays. And in our experience, we had changed what we could have changed. However, as I said, the deep rooted culture is still throwing spanners in the work and obstructing the reform, and we might take us back for regressive reform, i.e., to sort out our house as if what's taking place now would lead to instability and so on and so forth. So we need to amend this through certain reforms that might lead us backwards. Have we done with the uh, democratic transition? Have we reached the dead end? No, I don't think that we have reached the dead end. Yes, legally speaking, we might say so because there are guarantees for the society to be supportive, to have the oversight, and so on and so forth. However, at the same time, we notice that those some of those powerful, uh, they do have some despotic propensities that uh, uh, can depend on certain mechanisms that were used in the past. So, we don't have a conclusive guarantee that in the near future we might come back to quasi kind of despotism unless we have to have a certain mechanism to stop such propensity. Polarization is there. We cannot just split hairs here. Polarization is polarization, and despite the fact that the constituency of such polarization can be changing. Do we think that we all are responsible? Yes, without any exclusion, without any exemptions, we can understand the outcomes of the municipality elections. The outcomes indeed are emblematic of the punishment of all the political parties. So we all are responsible. As far as the uh, 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 civil society's role, we have here with us the vice chairman of the uh, uh, Tunisian Union of Laborers. What Rabia had floated summons deep kind of response, but I would like just to touch upon one word that she said. Yes, clientelism. The clientelism kind of culture is still there, so we cannot judge the political scene unless we understand the components of the scene itself. Here, we can talk about cronyism, clientelism. So, again, we cannot generalize, but still, as a headline, clientelism indeed governs the party's politics, and this would affect the outcomes definitely. Dr. Malki, just 1 minute, please. I have just to talk about 2 points. The first point was raised by brother Ismail Hamoudi, and I agree with him 100%. The 20th of February movement had not been influencing the events in Morocco deeply, albeit it was an interesting movement since its start, and it was successful to mobilize the youth in scores of minor, medium, and large cities in Morocco, and it had uh, uh, a ceiling that was lofty when it comes to its demands. However, its light has been dimmed slowly, and it had become weak for different reasons, objective and intrinsic. The objective ones I've touched upon, i.e., the monarchy recovered the political initiatives, and it initiated indeed the reform, and all the parties were with the reforms. And I mentioned there were 150 memos of reform, 100 entities, and a committee that was established. So the monarchy met the needs of such movement. However, The movement itself uh, uh, had suffered intrinsically. First, it is not it is incoherent movement because it has radical leftist, also political radical Islamists. So we had two poles, kind of two extreme poles that had no commonalities whatsoever. So this affected indeed the movement negatively. And I think it lacked the mind, it lacked the mastermind, it lacked the reason. And uh, this, as a matter of fact, was the uh, dominating factor. They had no elite, they had no intellectuals who would lead such movements. And this can be applied to other movements as well. Objectively speaking, as well, the 20th of February movement, in accordance with the uh, different struggles on strategies and so on and so forth. Uh, as a matter of fact, the government played a role in the manifestations of this movement. That's why the uh, 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 20th of February movement uh, was weak. As far as Louise's uh, question, if we mean by the constitutional parliamentary for the monarchy to be just uh, uh, a power with no power, as in Britain, I think this is uh, cannot take place in Morocco. However, if you talk about parliamentarian monarchy for the incremental redistribution of power, whereby the monarchy can resemble a balance with the parliament. The constitution said that it is a monarchy, the regime of power in Morocco, social speaking and economic speech. But we need perhaps uh, courageous strides on the part of the monarchy so that its practices can be conforming with the modern nature in economy, in other kind of sectors. We cannot be modernizing cosmetically, and the core is traditional. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Mohammed Jamil. Yes, please. Thank you. We've started with Tunisia, Morocco, Mauritania, Libya, and then Algeria. This chronology is to do with the geography, and that's why minutes can be allocated accordingly, and that's why I'll take more time than the others, perhaps. Talking about our societies being undemocratic, in order to justify the undemocratic status, we need actually to wonder here. Societies cannot be democratic unless there is a democracy, and democracy cannot be propagated unless there is a democratic environment. And that's why we cannot say that the socio-economic problems can be the justification for the lack of democracy. It cannot be a justification. The other issue is that we cannot wait until all the links of the Arab Spring, the virtual and the potential, can be met before we rectify it. First, we don't know when these links will be unfolding, and I think that 8 years of the Arab Spring uh, entail the necessity of rectifying the matter. The third observation is to do with the ceilings. I understand that the democratic status in Mauritania might be better than the one in Algeria, and the political stability in Mauritania might be better than in Libya. But when it comes to analyzing the ceilings, I think the three countries are in the same basket. I said that in Tunisia we had raised the bar to the stratosphere. As the gentleman said, this would lead to reform, and this is natural when the government would resort to the reason rather than to the passion. In Morocco, the ceiling is there, is known, and all the parties know this ceiling. They accept or they are compelled to accept. In these three countries, I said there is no ceiling that we know, and thus Mauritania can meet with Libya and Algeria. And I hope that the expected political transformations post 2019 would have a window of hope in my capacity as a politician and capacity as a thinker as well. Lastly, the deep state in Mauritania. All the countries in the Maghreb had a deep state with the ambiguity of the term itself. With the grace of God, our deep state is unlike the deep state in Egypt. So the deep states do differ from one country to another. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sanusi. 1 minute, please. Yes, 10 minutes is not enough to talk about weapons and media and so on and so forth. Yes, I touched upon the uh, foreign powers. I said that the two parties are supported by foreigners, and I cannot delve into them within 10 minutes. Mr. Ahmed, I think that maturity is not there. The ripening moment is not there. The politicians, as well as the others, are far away from reaching to each other. What we are talking about here, the settlement is contradicting any potential of settlement, and the foreign element adds insult to injury. The gentleman said that I was biased. No, the tribes that he's talked about estranged themselves and they dissociated themselves. I didn't do so. Second, I assessed the approach of the settlement in Libya, and I said that it has shortcomings from two points of view because it failed in the societal reconciliations, and as a matter of fact, there is a huge failure on the part of the government because it did not provide a solution. And as a matter of fact, I said as well that the National Congress had in place the political isolation law, and I said that this was a blunder. This was a huge blunder, and the implications thereby were very negative. So, in 10 minutes, I cannot just meet your end and say that they were militias and so on and so forth. Do you think that I'm praising the militias? No, the militias are do present a problem, but they surface because of the mismanagement of Libya. I cannot talk about the features. Uh, there is uh, uh, there is plenty to talk about here. The features of mismanagement of the crisis after 2011. I said that there were 190,000 people who resembled the commission, and I said that there were plenty of militias and plenty of shields. And Saib Nada, I think that just commenting on what the gentleman said, democracy needs education, needs a culture in Libya. We were away from the rest of the world for decades. I'd like to give you an example. One party leader went to the bank, and one civil servant uh, said to him, so he said to him, "My son, do you have you not heard of those of the Prophet peace be upon him who said that those who are those who do belong to a party would be burn in hellfire. And this was nothing to do with the prophet saying. It was to do with the green book that Gaddafi had authored. And this gentleman was the head of the accounting department at that bank. Why do you think in Egypt the issue was different? It is to do with the level of awareness. So, but I'll stop here. Please, the time is tight and 1.5 minutes. In accordance with what I've heard from my brothers, they reached the same outcome because we have talked about a logic continuum, perhaps progress or setback or moving ahead. And constitutionally speaking, we can talk about these setbacks or perhaps weathering the storm. As Abdanur has said, if we studied these issues collectively, it would have been better because methodologically speaking, we could have ended up understanding the features of uh, reneging on the promises or reaching a setback or reaching a dead end. Otherwise, we won't reach anywhere. Thank you, Mr. Mohammed Sibashir. Despite that, we exceeded the time by half an hour, but I was happy to see such enthusiasm. At the end of this session, I would like to thank all the panelists who spoke in this session: Muhammad Idris, Muhammad Maliki, Muhammad Jamil, Al-Sanusi, and Muhammad Sibashi. Thank you very much indeed. I'll be having a break. We'll have 15 minutes break rather than half an hour.